Have you ever wondered what $92 million worth of family betrayal looks like? My name is Whitney Cole. 5 years ago, I was the rising star of New York's luxury development scene until I walked away from it all. I traded my career for a stethoscope and medication schedules to care for my father, Victor Cole, after a devastating stroke. While my sister Jamie was busy building her influencer brand in the Mediterranean, I was the one holding my father's hand through every painful step of his recovery in our Miami estate. But 3 weeks ago, the golden child returned. And yesterday, my parents did the unthinkable. In a room overlooking the Atlantic, my father handed Jamie everything: the CEO chair of Cole Holdings, the real estate empire, and the legacy I had spent 5 years protecting. My reward: a check for $50,000 and a smirk. They laughed when I calmly signed the papers, giving up my entire inheritance without a fight. They thought I was defeated. They thought I was just a loyal nurse who had lost her edge. But they forgot one thing. I wasn't just watching them for 5 years, I was building a ghost empire that's about to haunt them. If this story of standing your ground resonates with you, please subscribe and let me know in the comments. Would you choose loyalty or revenge? Your support helps me bring these stories to life. Now let's see what happens when the invisible daughter finally speaks up. My silver sedan glided away from the Cole estate under the neon glow of Miami's skyline, leaving behind the only life I had known for half a decade. For 5 years, that house hadn't been a home. It was a high-stakes medical ward where I played the roles of nurse accountant and silent guardian. When Victor Cole suffered that massive stroke, the doctors whispered about permanent paralysis, yet I refused to listen. I traded my tailored New York blazers for scrubs, spending my nights memorizing medication interactions and my days forcing my father through grueling physical therapy sessions that left us both exhausted. But my labor didn't stop at his bedside. While Victor lay incapacitated, Cole Holdings began to bleed from the inside due to the incompetence of his senior managers. I spent the quiet hours between 3 and 5 in the morning deep diving into spreadsheets, discovering massive financial leaks and tax irregularities that would have sent the company into bankruptcy before Jamie even landed her first private jet in Spain. I fixed them all from a laptop on a kitchen counter, ghostwriting memos and restructuring debt under my father's digital signature just to keep the family legacy afloat. Meanwhile, my phone would incessantly buzz with notifications from Jamie. She was living a Technicolor dream in Ibiza and Saint-Tropez, sending me photos of sun-drenched yachts and champagne showers while I was scrubbing floor tiles and arguing with insurance adjusters. Her captions always read like a mockery: living my best life while sis plays house. She didn't contribute a single cent or a minute of her time, yet she remained the golden daughter in my parents' eyes because she maintained the Cole image on social media. The true sting came 6 months ago when Victor finally stood up without his walker. I expected a moment of shared triumph, perhaps even a thank you for saving his life and his fortune. Instead, he looked at me with a cold, clinical detachment that felt like a slap. He claimed that my 5 years of isolation had turned me into a domestic shadow, a woman who had lost the killer instinct required to navigate the shark-infested waters of Miami real estate. He told me that while he appreciated the nursing, I had become too complacent and soft for the boardroom. According to him, Jamie was the one with the vision, the one who understood the modern world of branding and luxury, while I was just the girl who knew how to organize pill bottles. He completely ignored the fact that the very company he was handing to her only existed because I had spent my youth being his silent architect. Every time I tried to mention the financial restructuring I'd handled, he would cut me off, insisting that his old managers must have simply found their rhythm again. The unfairness burned in my chest, a slow-rolling fire that I kept hidden behind a neutral expression. They wanted a ghost, so I decided to become one that would eventually pull the rug out from under their feet when they least expected it. Whitney stepped into the 45th floor of a sleek glass tower in Brickell, where the hushed atmosphere of Sentinel Marine and Estates immediately washed over her. This wasn't the chaotic, ego-driven environment of Cole Holdings. It was a cathedral of precision and strategic silence that I had meticulously constructed over the last 5 years. While the world saw me as a dutiful daughter preoccupied with blood pressure monitors and hospital gowns, this office was the heartbeat of my true identity. Sentinel Marine and Estates, or SME, started as a boutique consultancy for ultra-luxury yacht interiors, but it quickly evolved into a powerhouse for high-end resort master planning. I operated through encrypted servers and trusted intermediaries, ensuring my fingerprints never appeared on the public records that Victor Cole so obsessively monitored. This company was my sanctuary, a fortress built brick by brick, with the profits I earned from advising my father's competitors on the very deals he was too arrogant to secure. Walking toward the corner office, I was greeted by Alicia Rodriguez, my lead counsel, and the only person who knew the full extent of my double life. Alicia Rodriguez stood by the floor-to-ceiling window holding a leather-bound folder with a triumphant glint in her eyes. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, simply sliding the document across the mahogany desk. It was the official confirmation from the Miami Harbor Authority. Sentinel Marine and Estates had officially beaten Cole Holdings for the development rights of Azure Bay. This was the crown jewel of Miami real estate, a massive waterfront project comprising a boutique resort and a private marina valued at $45 million. Victor had poured every remaining resource into this bid, convinced that his legacy depended on it. He had no idea that the competitor who just snatched it from under his nose was the same daughter he had dismissed as a domestic shadow only 48 hours prior. The strategy behind this victory was a calculated exploitation of my father's greatest professional flaws. During the 5 years I spent managing his affairs, I had documented every blind spot in his business model. I knew Victor Cole was obsessed with traditional opulence and outdated grandeur, often ignoring the environmental sustainability and technological integration that modern billionaire investors demanded. My proposal for Azure Bay was everything his was not. It was forward-thinking, ecologically conscious, and integrated with a proprietary smart marina system I had developed in secret. I knew exactly which board members he tried to intimidate and which contractors he had underpaid in the past. I utilized that knowledge to build a coalition of partners who were eager to see a new leader in the Miami market. While Victor relied on his fading reputation and brute force, I relied on data and the intimate knowledge of his failures. Alicia watched as I signed the final acceptance papers, the ink drying on the contract that would effectively starve Cole Holdings of its future. I wasn't just taking a project, I was reclaiming the 5 years of expertise they tried to tell me I no longer possessed. My father wanted me to stay in my lane, so I decided to build a highway that led straight over his empire. A week later, Jamie's inaugural gala for Cole Holdings unfolded on a rented superyacht drifting lazily off the coast of South Beach. The deck was crowded with Miami's elite influencers and local politicians, all lured by the promise of witnessing the new era of the Cole legacy. Jamie moved through the throng like a queen, her silk dress catching the moonlight. Yet to my trained eyes, her performance was a hollow spectacle. She attempted to command the room with grand pronouncements about the future of our waterfront developments, but she stumbled awkwardly when a veteran developer asked about maritime zoning laws and riparian rights. Her face flushed as she brushed off the technical questions with a dismissive wave, claiming that such trivialities were for the assistants to handle. It was painfully obvious to everyone with real skin in the game that she didn't know the difference between a mooring permit and a property deed. She was playing a CEO in a high-budget music video, oblivious to the fact that the industry she was trying to lead was built on the very details she ignored. The atmosphere shifted when Ethan Vance, the formidable chairman of Vance Capital, stepped onto the mahogany deck. Victor had been chasing an audience with Ethan Vance for nearly 2 years, knowing that a partnership with his venture capital firm was the only thing that could truly solidify Cole Holdings' shaky foundations. Jamie, intoxicated by the cameras flashing around her, immediately targeted him. She tried to leverage her social media clout, showing Ethan her engagement metrics on her phone as if they were a substitute for a balance sheet. She spoke in buzzwords about brand synergy and lifestyle disruption, completely failing to realize that a man who manages billions of dollars isn't impressed by 1 million followers. Ethan's expression remained an unreadable mask of professional politeness. When Jamie tried to suggest they take a partnership selfie, he coolly stepped back, his eyes searching the room for someone with actual substance. The silent contempt in his gaze was a surgical strike to Jamie's ego, but instead of retreating, she became desperate to prove she was the visionary my father claimed her to be. In her frantic drive to secure a win that would silence the skeptics, Jamie fell directly into the trap I had seen coming months ago. A representative from a shady offshore entity posing as a Mediterranean investment group approached her with an exclusive funding offer for the Azure Bay project she thought she still had a chance to win. Blinded by the desire to outshine my past accomplishments, Jamie bypassed our family's traditional legal review process. She signed a memorandum of understanding that included a predatory bridge loan agreement with a shell company. She didn't realize that the document contained hidden cross-collateralization clauses, effectively pledging the core assets of Cole Holdings as security for a loan that would never be funded. By the time the final champagne bottle was emptied that night, Jamie had unknowingly placed our father's entire life's work into a financial vice. She thought she was signing the deal of a lifetime, but in reality she had just handed over the keys to the castle to an invisible enemy. While my parents beamed with pride at their star daughter, the timer on the Cole empire had officially begun to count down. My phone vibrated against the polished mahogany of my desk just as I was reviewing the final signatures for the Azure Bay partnership. I didn't need to look at the caller ID to know who it was. The specific ringtone for the Cole estate was enough to send a familiar chill through the room. I let it ring for 3 full cycles, savoring the silence of my own office before finally sliding the bar to answer. Victor Cole's voice didn't offer a greeting. It arrived like a thunderclap laden with the same entitlement that had defined my existence for the last 5 years. He spoke as if I were still sitting at the edge of his bed waiting for his next command. He demanded that I come to the headquarters immediately to fix a few clerical errors that Jamie had encountered with a new investment group. He sounded stressed, his breathing heavy, yet his ego remained intact. He told me that my sister was far too busy with high-level strategy to be bogged down by paperwork technicalities, and that my background in domestic management made me the perfect candidate to clean up the mess. It was clear that the clerical errors were actually the legal landmines Jamie had stepped on during her gala, and the walls were beginning to close in on Cole Holdings. The conversation grew increasingly strained as Victor's tone shifted from commanding to patronizing. He mentioned that he hadn't heard from me since I left and assumed that my $50,000 must be nearly exhausted. He chuckled darkly, suggesting that the cost of living in Miami was a harsh wake-up call for someone who had been living under his roof for free. He even went as far as to offer me a junior administrative position with a modest salary provided I apologized to Jamie for my sudden departure. He was so blinded by his own perceived superiority that he couldn't imagine a world where I wasn't desperate for his crumbs. He genuinely believed that without his name and his money, I was nothing more than a failed caregiver struggling to pay rent. The irony was almost overwhelming. As he was offering me an entry-level job to save his skin, I was holding a contract that effectively controlled the future of his most coveted project. He talked down to me as if I were a child playing house, unaware that the house he was standing in was already starting to burn. My response was cold, calculated, and devoid of the submissiveness he expected. I told him quite clearly that I was no longer a servant to his legacy or an unpaid intern for my sister's incompetence. I informed Victor that my time was far too valuable to be spent correcting the mistakes of a CEO who didn't know the first thing about the business she inherited. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When he finally found his voice, it was distorted by a cocktail of rage and disbelief. He didn't ask what I was doing or how I was surviving. Instead, he defaulted to his oldest weapon threats. He swore that he would use every connection in Florida to crush any attempt I made at a career. He vowed that by the time he was finished, I wouldn't be able to get a job at a lemonade stand in Miami, let alone a real estate firm. He promised to make my name toxic in the industry, oblivious to the fact that my name was already on the masthead of the company that was about to dismantle him. I ended the call without a goodbye, the dial tone a final period to a relationship that had been dead long before the inheritance was ever read. Promptly at 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy oak doors of Howard Finch's law office creaked open, signaling the beginning of a confrontation that would dismantle decades of family hierarchy. Victor and Jamie were already seated, their faces etched with a mixture of impatience and lingering arrogance. They expected me to walk in alone, perhaps looking disheveled or repentant, ready to beg for the junior administrative role Victor had so generously offered. Instead, the room fell into a suffocating silence as I entered, flanked by a team of elite corporate attorneys and Ethan Vance himself. The sight of the chairman of Vance Capital standing firmly by my side sent a visible jolt through my father. Victor scrambled to his feet, his mouth hanging open as he struggled to process why the man he had been desperately courting for years was now acting as my personal escort. Jamie's polished facade shattered instantly, her eyes darting between my tailored power suit and the legal brief Alicia held. There was no social media filter that could hide the sudden realization that the domestic shadow they had dismissed was actually moving in circles far above their own. I didn't wait for them to regain their composure before I placed a single cream-colored envelope on the mahogany conference table. This was the letter that would bridge the gap between their delusions and my reality. Inside was the certified deed of award from the Miami Harbor Authority, confirming that Sentinel Marine and Estates was the sole developer for the Azure Bay project. I watched Victor's hands tremble as he read the names, his face turning a ghostly shade of white when he saw my signature as the founding CEO. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat as he realized Cole Holdings hadn't just lost a bid. They had been outmaneuvered by a phantom they never saw coming. Ethan Vance leaned forward, his voice cold and professional, informing my father that Vance Capital had officially moved its entire $45 million investment portfolio away from Cole Holdings and into my firm. The betrayal Victor felt was palpable, yet it was nothing compared to the legal devastation I was about to unveil. The final blow arrived not with a shout, but with a calm recitation of financial facts. I looked directly into my father's eyes and revealed that I hadn't just been building a rival company. I had been monitoring Jamie's disastrous gala dealings in real time. I disclosed that the Mediterranean investment group she had so recklessly signed with was actually a subsidiary I controlled through Alicia's firm. Jamie had effectively pledged every core asset of Cole Holdings, including the family estate and the downtown headquarters, as collateral for a predatory loan that my company now owned. In an instant, the power dynamic in the room flipped entirely. I wasn't just a competitor anymore. I was now the primary creditor of my father's life's work. Victor's face transitioned from white to a deep, alarming shade of red, his chest heaving with a mixture of humiliated rage and pure shock. He realized that for 5 years he had been underestimating the very brain that kept his heart beating. He had treated me like a servant while I was quietly becoming his master. As Jamie began to sob, realizing the keys to the castle she thought she held were now just pieces of scrap metal, I stood up and adjusted my blazer. The $92 million inheritance they used to taunt me was now irrelevant, because I didn't need their money. I now owned their debt. The atmosphere in the conference room turned leaden as two federal agents in dark suits stepped through the door, their sudden presence silencing the room more effectively than any legal argument could. I sat motionless watching as the reality of the situation began to set in for my family. During my weeks of auditing the distressed debt Jamie had accumulated, I had uncovered far more than just bad business decisions. I had found a trail of systematic embezzlement. Jamie had been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Cole Holdings operating accounts to fund her extravagant European lifestyle and maintain the illusion of a jet-setting mogul on social media. She hadn't just been incompetent, she had been criminal. As the agents presented a warrant for the company's financial records, the room erupted into a chaotic symphony of desperation. Jamie's polished facade vanished, completely replaced by a shrill, frantic panic. She didn't try to defend herself with logic. Instead, she turned on our parents like a cornered animal, screaming that it was their fault for putting her in a position she never asked for. Jamie's voice cracked as she accused Victor of being a controlling dinosaur who forced her into the CEO role just to satisfy his own vanity. She shrieked that they should have known she wasn't cut out for spreadsheets and legalities, effectively blaming the people who had just handed her a $92 million kingdom. Victor sat frozen in his chair, the deep red of his face fading into a sickly, ashen gray. He watched in horrified silence as his golden child shredded the last remnants of his dignity in front of his most respected peers and federal officers. The realization was visible in his eyes. He had destroyed his relationship with his capable daughter to empower a thief who was now leading him towards a prison sentence. The legacy he had spent 40 years building wasn't just being taken over, it was being incinerated by the very person he had chosen to protect it. My mother sat beside him weeping silently, finally seeing the monster they had created through decades of blind favoritism and indulgence. The devastation didn't stop with the legal intervention. As news of the federal investigation and the Azure Bay loss hit the industry wires in real time, the internal betrayal of Cole Holdings' allies began. One by one, the long-term partners and subcontractors who had stood by Victor for decades realized the ship was sinking. The same men who had ignored my presence during family dinners for years were now sliding their business cards across the table toward me, bypassing my father entirely. They weren't just leaving, they were begging for a seat at the table with Sentinel Marine and Estates. They saw the writing on the wall. The Cole name was now radioactive, and I was the only one in Miami with the capital and the vision to lead the next era of development. The loyalty they once felt for Victor evaporated the moment they saw the handcuffs being prepared for Jamie. I watched as my father's oldest friend, a man who had known him since college, apologized for his former association and asked Alicia for a private meeting to discuss moving his firm's contracts to my control. The empire hadn't just fallen, it had been abandoned by everyone Victor thought he could trust. I stood there, the only calm person in a sea of ruin, realizing that the best way to destroy a hollow structure is simply to reveal the rot within. Whitney stood on the edge of the Azure Bay Pier, her eyes fixed on the cerulean horizon, where the Atlantic Ocean met the cloudless Miami sky. The salt air felt clean, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the law office I had walked out of only hours ago. Behind me, the rhythmic sound of heavy footsteps on the wooden planks announced a presence I no longer felt obligated to acknowledge. Victor approached first, his gait labored and stripped of its former boardroom swagger, followed closely by my mother, whose eyes were swollen from a night of realization. They didn't come with flowers or an apology for the 5 years of my life they had treated as a disposable resource. Instead, Victor held a stack of foreclosure notices, his voice trembling, as he begged me to use my new position as their primary creditor to save the family estate, the last symbol of a legacy that was currently being liquidated to pay off Jamie's debts. He spoke of family unity and blood ties, the very concepts he had trampled on when he handed my life's work to a thief. My mother reached for my hand, her voice a desperate whisper as she pleaded for me to think of our history, but I stepped back, maintaining a distance that was both physical and emotional. I looked at the man who had once been my hero and saw only a stranger who valued optics over substance. I reminded Victor of the words he had used when he handed me that $50,000 check, that in the world of high-stakes business, everything must have a corresponding value, and loyalty that doesn't produce a profit is merely a liability. I told him that I was simply following his curriculum. By his own logic, saving their house was a poor investment with zero return. There would be no reconciliation, no tearful embrace, and certainly no rescue mission. I had spent 5 years being the silent pillar holding up their world while they mocked my invisibility. It was only fair that they finally learned what happens when that pillar decides to walk away and build its own foundation elsewhere. The long-term fallout for the rest of the Cole family was a swift and brutal lesson in reality. Jamie, stripped of her influencer filters and corporate titles, was currently facing a 5-year suspended sentence and a permanent ban from the financial industry. She had become a pariah among the Miami elite she so desperately craved to lead her name, synonymous with the very incompetence and greed that had dismantled Cole Holdings. Victor, unable to secure new investors or manage the mountain of litigation Jamie had invited, was forced to watch as the company he built was carved up by creditors and sold for parts. They lost the mansion, the yachts, and the reputation, eventually retreating to a modest rental, far from the glittering coast they once thought they owned. As I watched the first construction cranes arrive at Azure Bay to begin work on my resort, I realized that my true worth was never tied to the $92 million inheritance I had been denied. It was built in the quiet hours of the night, in the medication schedules I mastered, and in the ghost empire I constructed when no one was watching. Success is the only revenge that requires no explanation, and as the sun set over my pier, I knew I was finally free.